Gonna tell my therapist that I'm spending this week healing my inner child. Hi besties, welcome. I hope you're doing well. I love children's books. I've been an avid reader since I was in preschool. My parents' first priority when I was growing up was that I knew how to read. While I was young, I got to experience some amazing, amazing children's literature that has truly shaped who I am today. And it's work that I return to often because I still find it so rich with meaning and hope and joy. And it reminds me of being 5 years old or 8 years old or 10 years old. I love Kayla's videos over at Books and Lala where she reads her favorites from like each year of her life thus far. And I wanted to do something similar. I'm gonna read my favorites from elementary school this week. You'll see when you see them, they're all ratty and torn up because I read them over and over and over. They all just felt like a home for me, but I haven't read any of them recently, so I'm really excited to go back and sort of dive in this week. So let's just dive into what I'm gonna be reading this week. First up, I have Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. I easily could have chosen any Kate DiCamillo book for this because her books were the soundtrack to my life growing up, but Because of Winn-Dixie is the first one that I read and probably my favorite. This book is filled with so many colorful characters, and I feel that it's important to let you know that this is actually my third or fourth copy of this book because the one that I had when I was in kindergarten did not survive. It was torn in a million pieces. It had tape all over the spine, and even then it was not staying intact. For each of these books, I'm gonna try to tell you about my first memory of reading it, and this one is so vivid and clear in my head. I was at my after-school program, and I was in the 5-year-old's room, and we were all playing centers, and I was reading Because of Winn-Dixie because I couldn't put it down. And I remember so vividly reading the scene where the mouse scurries across the floor in the Picket Quick that they've converted into a church, and when Dixie chases it and catches it. And I just thought it was so funny. Even if you're not a young person anymore, you were once, and that past you will appreciate this story, I promise. And so will present you, honestly. I love it so much. Next up, I have Ramona's World by Beverly Cleary. Again, I could have chosen any Ramona book, honestly any Beverly Cleary book. I have ingrained in my mind the exact spot in my city's library in the children's room where Beverly Cleary's books used to be. They've probably been moved now. I could find them in my sleep. But Ramona's World was always my favorite Ramona book because this is the book in which she meets her best friend Daisy, and I remember so clearly sitting in my childhood room in my closet and reading the scene in which Ramona falls through the ceiling and her legs are like dangling through the ceiling. That image has stuck in my head for years and years, and whenever I think of the Ramona books, that's the image that first comes into my mind. Next up, I knew I had to choose a Roald doll, but it was really tough to choose which one. I was trying to decide between Matilda and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Ultimately, I went for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because I read this book over and over as a kid, as evidenced by the fact that I have 2 copies. The back cover is torn off one, and the other has seen better days. This one I remember reading in the freshman room was what it was called of my daycare program over the summer. And I remember reading this copy sitting at the little table in my little plastic chair. Next up is Bridge to Terabithia by Katherine Patterson. If you don't know the book, you probably know the movie with Josh Hutcherson and Anna Sophia Robb. The book is incredible. This book is actually the first time I experienced a spoiler that I can recall. I know exactly who spoiled it. I'm still mad about it. I still have a grudge. Even though it was spoiled for me, it still moved me to the point of tears. I actually remember when I read this, I cried to spite the guy who spoiled it for me. Like, he was not there when I read it, but I was like, I will not let his spoiler ruin my emotional reaction to this book. And so I got to the really sad part and I was like, cry, Sally, cry, cry. And I did. And finally, we have Each Little Bird That Sings by Deborah Wiles. This was my favorite book for years and years and years. I read this for the first time in 5th grade in Miss Poole's class. I remember sitting there reading it and crying. It's about a girl who lives in a funeral home, and her family members all have different jobs around the funeral home, but when one of her family members passes away, she has to re-examine how she looks at death and grief because for the first time in her life it's personal. Deborah Wiles writes so deftly. She meets children where they are and she doesn't talk down to them or patronize them, and I'm so grateful for this book. I love it so very much. All right, little Sally, let's kick it. We're here filming on location at my elementary school. That's where we are right now. Let's talk about Because of Winn-Dixie. This is solidified upon a reread as one of my favorite books of all time. This book was one of the first books that unlocked the magic of reading for me. Because of Winn-Dixie is probably the first book I ever read that gave me friends and a community within the pages of a novel. One of my favorite things about Kate DiCamillo as a writer is that she meets the reader where they are. If you are a 5-year-old and this is the first big kid book you've ever read, it meets you perfectly there. And if you're a 23-year-old returning to the book you read as a 5-year-old, it meets you where you are too. And I read this one out loud to my mom, and it's perfectly written for her as well at 60. Every time I read it, it tells me something I didn't know that I needed to hear. Also, it was the first time I read it and have had a dog. Like, I've never had a dog before I got Athena. My unconditional and deep, like, scary love for this dog only added to my experience reading this because of Opal talking about Winn-Dixie and talking about how dogs can be healing and can be our best friends and things like that. It made me think so much of my own dog and how much light she has infused into my life since I've gotten her. A couple weeks ago, I listened to the podcast On Being. I listened to the episode in which they interview Kate DiCamillo, and it's brilliant. She talks about what responsibility comes with writing literature for young people. And her take on that is that authors of children's literature have a responsibility to their young readers to tell the truth, to not sugarcoat the world, but to explain that the world is scary and bad things do happen, but they also have a responsibility to make that truth bearable. Hearing her talk about that was so eye-opening to me into understanding why I loved her book so much, because she never condescends to the reader and tries to convince them that there's nothing wrong in the world, that people can't do bad things. She always tells the truth, but she makes it bearable. She tells the truth about the bad while also telling the truth about the good, which is that we live in a beautiful world full of beautiful, good, loving people, and both of those things can be true at the same time. I recommend it so much. It'll make you feel 5 years old in the best way. I highly recommend that podcast too. The movie, also 10 out of 10, incredible. One of my favorite book to movie adaptations of all time. So good. Ramona's World. This was a fun reread. I will say, more so than Winn-Dixie, this book felt like it was written for a child. There wasn't a ton in here as an adult that I was like, yes, still feel that. It definitely made me think of my, 5-6-year-old self. I remember really relating to Ramona. So it did give me a little peek into what my childhood self valued and cared about and felt, but I didn't feel as connected to it as an adult like I did with Winn-Dixie. But that's okay, because it's a children's book and it's written for children, and it was perfect for me as a child. So yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed myself. I love Ramona. I chose the one that I remember being the most fun, and maybe the others would have a little bit more for me as an adult to think about and comment on. So I had a good time. On to the next. let's talk all things Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I had so much fun rereading this book. As soon as I started reading the book, I was dropped back into the world like no time had passed since I first read it. Because there was so much distance between when I had read it previously and this reread, some of it felt new again to me, which was so special and fun. And I forgot how vivid the imagery is in this book. Like, it's impossible to read this and not see it all in your head and feel like you're walking through the Chocolate Factory. Roald Dahl was really like, how do I get kids excited to read my book? I'll make it about chocolate. He understood the assignment. There were definitely things, though, in this book that I noticed that I didn't notice as a child, like how clear it is that Roald Dahl is kind of putting his own philosophy about child rearing into the pages of the book by giving you these 4 children that Willy Wonka deems as the bad kids. It was something I noticed more as an adult, the nuances behind that maybe being a persuasive tactic. I just love the way Roald Dahl writes. It's so visual and it's so quick and interesting that I just couldn't stop reading it. I felt when I was reading this like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen next? Even though I knew. I will say I didn't appreciate the Augustus Gloop of it all. I understand that Augustus Gloop's fatness was supposed to be a metaphor for gluttony and greediness, but I didn't appreciate it. I'm constantly trying to unlearn the fat phobia that we are taught every day growing up. To come back to a book that I loved so much and see it so obvious was a little bit jarring. I just wish that people found better ways to illustrate greed and gluttony than making fun of fat people for having bodies. Luckily, Augustus is the first to go, so besides that little snippet, I really enjoyed rereading it and it was really fun. It just brought me back so many memories that I didn't even remember that I had. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Next.
And I call this segment Public Schools. That's so upsetting. Oh my God. Cut the camera, it's dead ass.
The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. Let's get into it. I did not talk about this book at the beginning of this video because I didn't know I was going to read it. But as soon as I finished Because of Winn-Dixie, I was in desperate need of another Kate DiCamillo book. And so I read this one. It's wonderful. This book has an extremely special place in my heart, not only because it was one of my very favorite books as a child, but also because this book is now a play. And I was in a production of that play my senior year of high school. It was my final show on stage at my high school. Oh my God, wait, I have to get my Edward. It meant so very much to me. All the seniors got a prop Edward as their going away gift. And so I got Sailor Edward. Stop. And I love him very much, and I'll keep him forever and ever. This book, this show, took on a whole new meaning to me when I got to be a part of it. And so getting to read it this time was so interesting, having played some of the characters. It was hard not to see our high school production in my mind as I was reading the book. Edward Tulane is such a magical story. It's about a China rabbit who over the years gets passed from owner to owner to owner and experiences life in many different settings with many different people. At the start of the story, he is very vain and self-centered. By meeting these people that love him, his heart opens up and he's able to let love in. To me, this book is just so much about loving other people and letting them love you. It also has just the most beautiful illustrations. It's sort of impossible to read this story without having your heart crack open and expand in the same way that Edward's does throughout the story. And I love Edward. Thanks, Miss P, from me and Edward. foreseeable future, let's talk about Bridge to Terabithia. This book holds up. I forgot how much I remembered. It all came back to me as soon as I started reading. I think there's so much to gain from this book as an adult as well. It just goes to show how much imagination children have and how often they're told not to use it, and that the outlets for that imagination are so important. There's also a lot of messaging about toxic masculinity in this book in terms of Jess and his relationship with his father. Jess wants to be an artist and his dad is not interested in allowing Jess to be an artist. And his dad is super affectionate and gentle with Jess's sisters, but never with Jess, and Jess really feels that and takes that to heart. That messaging was really interesting coming back to it as an adult, especially now that we are having such massive conversations around toxic masculinity, and to see that I was thinking about those things when I was a kid, even if it was sort of subconsciously. No! Athena, no. Dog eating camera bag. I just think it's really brilliantly done, really brilliantly executed. Catherine Patterson, just like Kate DiCamillo, realized her responsibility to tell the truth, but make it bearable, because it's a devastatingly traumatic and tragic story, and yet it's so hopeful. And she finds a way to have both of those things in the same story, and that is so powerful and was so impactful to me as a child. Time we dive into Each Little Bird That Sings by Deborah Wiles. This is elite, top tier, best book I've ever read. It's amazing. This book felt like sliding into a freshly made bed with freshly washed sheets that are still warm from the dryer. I read the first chapter and was like, oh, I'm home. This book was a constant in my life during a very specific time in my life where nothing felt constant. When there was upheaval turning my entire life upside down, I still had comfort, and that's the main character of this book, not just the concept of comfort, but I also had the concept of comfort that this book and family brought me. I don't think I realized at the time that that's what I was putting into this book, was a need for stability and love through hardship. It's hard to talk about. Fuck! I did not think I was gonna cry just talking about this book. It's about being a good daughter and community member. It is about death and grief. It is about friendship and what happens when friendship goes away. It is about growing up in the South and drinking sweet tea. It is about all the ways that the people we love stay with us even after they leave. And as Uncle Edisto would say, it is about all the messy glory, which is how one of the characters in this book sort of describes life, is that in its glory, it is messy. And what do we have to celebrate? All of this messy glory. Go back in there, go back in there, go back in there. This, like when Dixie, had so much left for me to explore as an adult. This entire book is just about the fact that life has so many layers and none of them are black or white. They're always somewhere in between, and it's about a young girl who's figuring that out for the first time. I was in that same spot Comfort is, of finding out for the first time that things are incredibly complicated. I relate to Comfort more than any of the other characters that I've read in this video. This will forever be one of my very favorites. That concludes me reading like I am in elementary school again. I had such a blast with this video. I miss elementary school Sally. I think she would be really proud of this Sally, I hope. Shout out to all my elementary school teachers. Go Eagles. Please tell me down below what your favorite books as a kid were, because I want to know. Over on my Patreon, we are currently reading In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado and A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, and you still have time to sign up and read both of them if you want to discuss them. I will leave the link at the top of the description. Come join us. We would love to have you. All my other socials will be linked down below as usual. Like this video if you liked it. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because it helps me out more than you can possibly know. And as always, in case you haven't heard it today, I love you.